Joining us now on the debate in the nation's capital, Sheila Copps, former Liberal MP and MPP. Her father, Victor Copps, was the mayor of Hamilton from 1962 to 76. Tony Clement, current federal industry minister. His stepfather, John Clement, was an Ontario cabinet minister in the 1970s. David McGuinty, Liberal MP for Ottawa South since 2004. His father, Dalton McGuinty Sr., was an Ontario MPP in the late 1980s. And here in studio, Michael Layton, currently running for Toronto City Council. His father, Jack Layton, is the current leader of the federal NDP. His grandfather, Robert, was a cabinet minister in Brian Mulroney's government in the 1980s. And his great-grandfather, Gilbert Layton, was a Quebec member of the National Assembly from 1936 to 39. Good to have everybody in the nation's capital. And Mike, nice to meet you here today for the first time as well. I want to start, I guess we've got to get the pecking order right to begin with. So Sheila Copps, you were Deputy Prime Minister. Tony Clement, you're a Cabinet Minister. David McGuinty, you're an opposition MP. And Michael, you're not even in yet. So you're running for office right now. You're a candidate. So that's the order we're going to go through this in. Sheila, start by going back to, I think you were 10 years old when your dad first ran for mayor. And I wonder whether you liked the notion of being the daughter of the mayor.
Oh, I hated it when I was a child. I remember he got elected for the first time when I was in grade 4. And your classmates tease you. If you do something good in school, people accuse you of, getting favorites played. So no, I despised it when I was a kid. I think it was only as I became a teenager and an adult that I became actively interested in kind of public policy issues. So I guess it's a transformation.
Tony, let's go through a little bit of the background with you because, of course, you were not born with the last name Clement. You got that later in life. Fill in those blanks for us, if you would.
Sure. My natural father is a Greek Cypriot who was obviously married to my mother. They subsequently got divorced, and it was only after John T. Clement, who my stepfather, ended his political career in the 1975 provincial election. About 4 years after that he and my mother both remarried, and I was a 17-year-old at the time, took on the name Clement. So that my kind of involvement with a father or a family member was after the political career was over, but that gave me an interesting perspective on things as well.
David McGuinty, your dad, of course, Dalton McGuinty Sr., was an Ottawa School Board trustee for 13 years and then became the MPP provincially for the riding I guess you represent today federally. What do you recall about your dad's involvement in politics that either interested you or not back then?
Well, I remember the time when my dad loaded up about 8 of us into a station wagon before the seatbelt laws. And we were out knocking on doors and dropping pamphlets for John Turner, who was the MP in the riding I now hold, at least part of it. My dad was the riding association president, so we had a very early start in the practical aspect, Steve, of conducting political campaigns.
8 of you, so there were still 2 to come.
2 more to come.
Okay. Mike, you are 4th generation. I'm going to assume that you don't have much personal recollection of your great-grandfather's work in the National Assembly in Quebec.
No, that would have been a little too long ago.
But let's go back to Granddad, who was a minister in Brian Mulroney's government. Do you have any recollection of him?
Sure. We went down to Ottawa on a couple occasions on the class trips. You got a little bit of a unique perspective because one of your classmates had a grandfather there. My father was actually elected before him, however, in '81. So
that would have been Toronto City Council.
That would have been City Council, yeah, and I was only 3 or 4 at that time.
So you had
not much of a recollection of that either, but growing up through that and being a part of the movement in Toronto was an exciting time.
Sheila, at what point do you remember that disdain that you had for being the daughter of turned into something that you thought was kind of neat?
Well, I think the disdain was more the fact that you're trying to develop an identity as a child, and people always say you're the daughter of or the son of. There was another aspect that I loved. I mean, we used to go, when campaigns came, we used to go around to the bingo halls. And in those days, you would actually call one line of a card, and your father would give out a stuffed animal to the winner. So we had like 30 seconds to run around and put all the pamphlets down because, when people play bingo, that's very serious stuff. So I always loved the campaigning and the people part of it. What I didn't like was the fact that as a child, my own identity was kind of lost as I was trying to develop it. But at home on Sunday dinner, we had great debates on Sunday shopping, Sunday sports, any big issue of the day would usually result in a big family discussion that oftentimes gave us a taste for the argument that is the face of politics, really differing ideas and competing ideas being debated in a parliamentary platform. And
were you encouraged to kind of go your own way on those things?
Oh, absolutely. My father, I think, loved to kind of throw something out, and then I have 2 sisters and a brother, and just to see them all going at it. And my mother, of course, was on council herself for 13 or 14 years, so we had a very political background, and I think it encouraged us to express our opinions early and not be afraid of taking a stand that was different from the herd.
Now, Tony, I'm trying to remember, this is the mid-1970s where, admittedly, my memory's not too good on that anymore, but I think your stepdad, I mean, he suffered an unexpected and tough loss, right? He was a cabinet minister who lost in that election?
Yeah, that was 1975 election, 22 Tory MPPs went down to defeat. That was Bill Davis's first minority government, and he was the most senior to go down to defeat. He was Attorney General at the time, so that was big news.
So when you eventually get a kind of a political awakening and you start having conversations with him about those days, I'm guessing that, you know, he would be telling you stories that were not altogether favorable about public life. Is that fair to say?
Well, you know, it was interesting to have that interaction with him, you know, after the political career is over, because you get a bit more of a perspective rather than being in the midst of it all. And he's always been very positive about, you know, his political time. I got to see after politics that you could have another career and another whole life that was different from your political life. But if anybody knows John Clement, he always has a story or two, and that was a time of great. Of great men and women in politics. You're talking about Margaret Scrivener and John Rhodes and Claude Bennett. They still seem to me like giants, even in the space of 30 years separation.
David McGuinty, what was worse, having a dad as an MPP or having him be on the school board?
Oh, geez, yeah. You know, he used to say that he was sure that when he died he was going straight to heaven because he'd done all his years of purgatory on earth at the school board. You know, it was funny. He was a hard-working person. My parents both were, and so just by observing and watching Steve, the way he conducted himself, he was a full-time teacher at the university, and then would come back and look after the kids and go off to meetings until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Oftentimes, what we'd really appreciate was he'd come back home with a plate of sandwiches that were unfinished, so we could actually get an extra dinner around 11 o'clock at night. But no, it was great to watch him.
It's understandable.
Yeah, it was great to watch him because he was passionate about what he believed in, and we learnt by observing.
Huh. Now, I'm also trying to remember again, did he pass away while he was in politics?
Yes, he did. He did in 1990, that's right.
Okay, and was there any feeling in the family that, you know, having to work as hard as he did in public life maybe robbed him of some years?
I think that's fair. After his funeral, we came together. At that time, Premier Peterson was very gracious in suggesting that someone might want to consider to pick up the baton, so to speak, and that's exactly what Dalton Jr. did way back, now going on 20 years.
He was the guy who held the seat, that's right, ran in that by-election. And I think I've heard the story before about why they eventually decided he should be the guy. You want to tell it?
Yeah, it was easier because we already had signs made up, lawn signs with Dalton McGuinty on it, so it was cheaper and we could recycle them, and it just seemed to be an obvious choice.
That's the story
we just scribbled the junior on.
That's the story I heard. Okay, let's go to that eureka moment, and I just want to, by way of setting this up, talk about the Johnson family of Quebec, because they are perhaps the most incredible political story in Canadian political family history. You've got 3 men, all of whom became Premier of Quebec, from 3 different parties. Mm-hmm. You've got Daniel Johnson Sr., who quite unexpectedly at the age of 53 dies, and his 2 children, Pierre-Marc, or 2 of his children, Pierre-Marc and Daniel, swearing up until then that they would never go into public life because, of course, they never saw their dad because he was always in politics. But then there are 1 million people who line up to pass his casket after he dies, very much like the Pierre Trudeau or Rocket Richard funerals, which we may remember. And here's what Pierre-Marc Johnson once told me. I just want to read this quote. "We realized how much affection had been manifested for our father, and 6 days after his death, as he was buried, my perception and Daniel's had changed. That day, we both realized we might one day go into politics." This was, of course, before that, swearing they would never be caught dead in politics. Sheila, if you can, describe your eureka moment where you decided, not only was this my dad's business, but this is something I might want to try too.
Well, Well, I hate to say, I graduated from university with the thought that I might like to pursue journalism. And I got a job working on a newspaper, our old hometown Hamilton Spectator. And then I used to go to meetings and kind of think, the people that are making debate points, maybe I'd like to be changing places with them. And there was an election that came along with Stuart Smith in 1977. I was very young at the time. They were desperate for a candidate, so they asked me to run, and I had no responsibilities. I was very young, took a flyer.
This is the Ontario Liberals.
And the moment, I think the first week that I actually was out campaigning, I realized that this was something that I wanted to do as part of that I had found the place that really made me happy. I love the campaigning, I love the people, and I also love the ideas. And so it led to 28 years altogether in the political world.
Tony, the conventional wisdom on you is that not in the womb, but perhaps shortly thereafter, you've been interested in running for politics. Do you want to tell us when it really happened?
No, I think it was some few years after that, actually. And
but not many.
Well, you know, in my teen years. Sure, I saw it all around me. My mother, this is another point, my mother worked at Queen's Park as a single mom. She was, you know, an administrative assistant to one of the MPPs as well. Bill Hodgson. So I had it sort of from that side as well. So Queen's Park really was part of my life since my teen years. And at some point you say, you know, some of these people, I think I could do almost as good a job as they could do. And, you know, you have the chutzpah of being a teenager who knows everything. So at some point you say, you know what, at some point in my life, I'd like to try this.
Was there one speech or one event or one thing that happened?
You know, I think it was just a combination of things. My first political convention was in 1977 in Quebec City, where I was, that was a federal convention, obviously, and I was 16 years old, and obviously Mulroney was there, and these people who were driving towards a goal to form a government, and it was pretty heady stuff for a 16-year-old teen to be part of that, and to say, you know what, by the force of my own efforts, maybe I could make something of myself as well.
David McGuinty, I remember one former Conservative MP telling me that Diefenbaker came to his school, his high school, when he was 14 years old. He saw Diefenbaker speak, and from that moment on, he decided he wanted to be a Conservative MP, and eventually it happened. Do you have a moment like that?
My earliest recollections were my mom and dad used to play the old LP recordings of John Kennedy's speeches and force us all to sit down and listen to them. Which was a really, it was a moving time. My dad used to stop it and explain to us what he was trying to say. But I do remember in grade 10 in high school here in Ottawa when Pierre Trudeau came to speak, and that was a very riveting moment. It was just the regular gunslinging character that he was, no notes, just simply took questions, said very little, but answered all the questions for about an hour. It was a very powerful moment for me, and I remember it very well.
Now, Kennedy, I'm presuming because of the Irish Catholic thing, is that right?
Yes, very much so. My dad had been down at Harvard and actually had been asked to work on Kennedy's campaign way back when, his first Senate run, and unfortunately at the time, as he said, he had a couple of kids addicted to food, and so he had to focus on working instead.
Gotcha. Mike, this is your first campaign. Was there a eureka moment for you when you decided this is what I want to do too?
I think it's actually been a pretty natural progression. I've always liked getting involved on community issues. I can remember as a child standing on top of a blue box at the Commissioner Street incinerator when we were trying to shut it down and bring recycling to the city. There's just been moments like that throughout where I've gotten involved on community issues, and then the question came up, how can I best serve my community? I've been involved in working for not-for-profits for several years now, and this opportunity has come up, and I think that my energy can be best served helping the people of Toronto.
Okay, no campaigning tonight, Mike. This is a nonpartisan event, okay? Let's just go through, I think everybody assumes they know what your politics are, but let's just check, because your great-grandfather was a Liberal, your grandfather was a Conservative, your father's a New Democrat, so what are you?
Well, for municipal politics, we don't look at political parties so much. It's more about people. I've voted for the New Democrats in the past. I think my grandfather would respect my decision, and so I think I most likely would land somewhere around there on the spectrum. But
are you a card carrying?
I am a card carrying New Democrat.
So you're a New Democrat.
So I'm a New Democrat. Yes.
Okay. Did you have a choice about that?
Oh, of course. I've always been given a little bit of room to maneuver around where I've wanted to. There's always been support there, though. However, from my dad and from my mom, who I took a lot of lessons from about how to live my life and what I'm going to do.
Well, I'm not sure it's so obvious a question, and I look at the, Sydney, you want to give us that 3-shot in Ottawa there? Because Tony Clement is a Conservative, and so is his stepfather, and Sheila Copps is a Liberal, and so is her father, and David McGuinty's a Liberal, and so is his father. Tony, do you inherit your parents' politics in some respects?
I think it's part of it, or you could go completely the other way, and there could be cases, I'm sure, where the son or the daughter has very different political views. But it's all around you. You're meeting people who share those beliefs. You see the passion in how they conduct themselves. So you'd have to be a pretty strong person not to be influenced by that or to take that into account. And could I amend the record? The 77 convention was a Joe Clark convention. I don't want all the social media and the emailers taking me on. So I just want to correct that for the record as well.
Okay. David, how about you? You not only had the issue of a father being in, but of course your brother's a Liberal as well. Did you have any choice but to be a Liberal?
No. No, it was a gradual process. I mean, when I got to university, I got very engaged in student politics and went to university later in life, and then settled in the Liberal Party only after many years of living and working abroad in different settings, Steve. But it was a tradition. It was a tradition of sort of middle ground and Liberal values and principles, and my parents were as much teachers as they were parents. And so I think that the values that we were aligned with were, I think all of us would agree, are more aligned with the Liberal Party of Canada's values. So it was a natural fit.
Sheila,
I think there's also a bit of a, I remember the first discussions that I had with my grandmother and my father, a bit like Dalton Sr. My father was forced to go to all these political events. He was born in Haileybury and raised in Timmins. And my grandmother was a widow. She had 6 boys. And in those days, women did not attend political functions unaccompanied. So every night she'd line up one of the boys and they'd all have to go with her. And they'd have these whistle stops coming through. And my grandmother was an absolute political fanatic. So she would talk to us about why it was important to care for the little guy and kind of values-based. And I won't go into the big, long story about it. She had an education issue with the Minister of Education of the day, and she wrote him a letter. And that was what caused her to be a Liberal, and she used to talk about it. So of course you get that kind of at the table. It's about your parents teaching you and giving you direction, and you can reject it, but oftentimes it's not. I think people accept it.
I actually, if I can just say, I think Sheila's absolutely right. For me, it was as much the matriarch as the patriarch.
Yeah.
My mother has strong views and knows how to express them. So I don't think you can automatically assume it goes from the political. If the political actor is a male,
I think parents make a big influence on kids.
Yeah.
And if you like what your parents are saying and you like what you hear, then you tend to follow in their footsteps.
Mike, is this a dynastic thing?
Well, I think they're right that it's following. You do follow the values a little bit. This is what's instilled when you're growing up from both parents. That's for sure. But I think that really once you get out in those formative years around high school and university, when the issues of the day are coming up, that's when you start forming your own opinions about stuff. And I think it's there that you make your decision. Is it something I'm going to follow in my parents' footsteps, or maybe carve out a space for my own? It seems like the panel, and myself included, have perhaps fallen into the same value system and political area as our parents, but I don't think it's necessary.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I remember talking to Justin Trudeau about the fact that the first time he ran for office, there were people who hated his guts and they didn't know anything about the guy. They'd never met him. They knew nothing about where he stood on issues, but they knew he was the son of. And that name, for as many people who loved him because of the name, there was many people who couldn't stand him because of the name. And David, let's go to you first on this. Is that something where the name recognition, does it help more or hurt more? That the fact that you come in with yes, with name recognition, but maybe some baggage as well.
In my first campaign, Steve, in 2004, it was just about a month after the healthcare premium was brought in Ontario, and you could really feel it at the doors. But what I learned through the process is that, it's certainly in my riding of Ottawa South, and I'm sure it's the same right across the country, Canadians are so fair. Yeah, they'd speak their mind and sort of tell us what it was that what they felt about that healthcare premium at the time. But then they would, once getting that out of their system, they would turn and be fair and say, well, Tell me about you now. What is it you're running about, and what are you all about, and why are you running, and what will you do for us? So I learned very quickly in that campaign that Canadian people are just really fair. I don't think they pin anything on you, certainly not for a long time.
Sheila, did you run into situations where people would be mad at your dad and take it out on you?
Well, I think that when you're at civic politics, I mean, the beauty for Mike is that when you run at civic politics, you can be everybody's friend. And when you pick a party, doesn't matter what party you choose, you can assume that the majority of people are going to be against you. So your job as an MP is to try and reach that broad spectrum of people. But for sure, I think coming from a family where the emphasis was municipal politics was a lot easier, because people didn't hate my father because of the party that he was with. They gave him kind of the benefit of the doubt.
Tony, how about it for you?
Well, I had the benefit of running hundreds of kilometers away from where my stepfather ran, so that was perhaps the solution for me.
Got it. How about for you, Mike?
Well, I think Sheila's right. You have to, in municipal politics, you have to go out and form a relationship and build a trust with all the folks in your community.
But you'll be running in an area where some people don't like Jack Layton. Now, is that going to hurt you?
Well, I'm sure. I don't think it'll hurt because once folks get to know me and understand that I'm a different person and this is a different level of politics and the party isn't necessarily associated with it, and it's more about building community and representing your constituency at City Hall, I think they'll come around.
The issue, though, with a dynasty is that they don't give you that benefit of the doubt because they know who preceded you and they're making their judgments on that and less on you. Does that concern you?
So far it's been we've gotten a really good response that folks are listening to the ideas that I have and the approach that I'm going to take, and it's not that far away from the approach that I was shown throughout growing up. And they're responding well, and people are interested in the ideas and what I have to say. So
okay.
That's a good sign.
Let's go on to a segment of this discussion I'm going to call Advisor-in-Chief. And I call it that because I remember not too long ago, George W. Bush made quite a big deal of the fact that he did not consider his father, even though he had been president, to be his advisor-in-chief because, of course, Bush 41 would not have been conservative enough for Bush 43's base. So I want to find out. I want to find out for all of you whether it was sort of, similar or not. Sheila, to you first. What kind of advice would you have gone to your political parent for?
Well, as you know, Steve, my father was very sick before I ever went into politics, and there were lots of times I would have liked to get his advice. I did oftentimes use my mother as a sounding board, and if I wanted to know what the average voter would think, I'd come out of a cabinet meeting and call my mom and say, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? And very often she would pierce through all the front page stories and come up with the gem that you needed to kind of guide you in a decision. I didn't always agree with her, and I mean, that's also the evolution of politics. I may be a liberal, but I'm probably a lot more small L than what either of my parents would have been at the time. Gotcha.
Tony, what would you have gone to John to ask his advice about, politically speaking?
It's just such a different time now. I wouldn't, obviously, on public policy issues, they're just so different now than from 30 and 40 years ago. But what John Clement was all about was how he interacted with people, how decent he was as a human being, that to the bureaucracy, the public service, to his colleagues, and even to opponents. So that it was more that way he acted, which became a little bit of a touchstone for me. If I could aspire to his level of decency, I was doing okay.
Now, David, of course, your dad had passed away by the time you got elected, but as you were thinking about politics, or maybe looking at it at that time, what kind of things might you have asked his advice on?
Well, I was really involved in Dad's campaigns going back to his nomination and his election, so I got to know him like an adult, as not so much a father and son, but a adult-to-adult relationship, and that was a wonderful thing. And I learned a lot through that process. He went into public life at the provincial level, Steve, later in life. He actually got elected at age 60. But along the way, he used to remind me that if I ever thought about doing this, he said, it's important to invest the time in life, acquiring experience, and try to bring that experience forward for the benefit of people. And it's advice I took to heart. I did many things before finally seeking public office. But today, I will regularly call my mother, and she keeps me quite grounded.
You know who your mother's favorite premier is, eh?
Yeah, it better be.
Actually, you're going to be surprised, but your brother tells me it's actually William Davis, just for the record.
Okay.
Mike, let me ask you this. There is an assumption, I suspect, that you're taking a path that your father has been on before. He got elected to city council once upon a time, and now you're doing that. And it would seem impossible for us to believe that somewhere along the way he's not in the back rooms giving you tons of advice whether you want it or not. Is that the case?
Well, it's not, maybe not if I want it or not. I seek advice from him. Most of it's less around policy because it's very, very locally grounded in our neighborhood. And so I seek other people's advice for that. And it's more about the process. How do we bring people together to break down the barriers that stop us from finding those common solutions? And he's been pretty good at that over the years. And so I take that advice close to heart.
Now, Sheila, you've already revealed today that you broke cabinet confidence to go tell your mother stuff. So now that we know that, is there stuff in politics you just you'd never go to a parent with?
Oh, I mean, there were certain issues, I think probably on religious grounds. I mean, some of the issues that are still dividing Canadians today when it comes to issues of abortion, for example, or issues of a religious nature that my mother and I never saw eye to eye on. And I remember my sister graduated from medical school at McMaster, and that was the day that I had introduced sexual orientation as a prohibited ground of discrimination in the Ontario legislature. And I got to my sister's graduation and my mother said, I wish I could change my name, because it was so embarrassing to her to be associated with respect for and inclusion of homosexuals. And it was a different time and a different generation.
Tony, do you and John ever go offside on anything significant like that?
No, I would say, I try to keep the political discussion to a minimum because, they're a source of strength, but they live and die by my battles. And so the most frequent answer to the question, how are things on Parliament Hill or how are things in Ottawa, I try to say, just fine, everything's great,
yeah.
Everything's going according to plan. Because, they have no ability to deal with it. I'm the one, suiting up with the army, and they
worry. They do worry. They're parents. They love you, and they want you to do well.
So I try to avoid those discussions as much as possible.
How about you, Mike?
I wouldn't avoid those discussions, but because I've got a lot to learn. But it's definitely it comes up around the table, and we do enjoy talking about a variety of different issues depending on what's in the paper that day.
David, your brother told a story in caucus the very first day that he was premier and addressing the troops for the first time, so I guess we're talking 2003, and he quoted a story that he said your father told him. And I just want to have this opportunity to actually ask you about that and see if it's real or if he just made it up. He said that the best advice your father ever gave him was written on a sign on the steps leading into Queen's Park. And the sign said, "Watch your step." Is that a true story?
It's absolutely true.
Your dad said that?
He said it repeatedly in caucus. He said it was the most important thing he had learned since he arrived at Queen's Park and during his time there. So it was advice that he passed on to all of us.
Okay. Let's look at the next generation down. Sheila, I know you've got a daughter. Does she hate politics?
Well, it's funny because you were talking earlier about Justin Trudeau, and I remember seeing Pierre Trudeau for the first time. I was participating in a basketball tournament in Montreal when I saw him give his first speech to the Liberal convention, and it really made a great impact on me. She hated it for a while, especially when I was, in the last few years when I was kind of going through my travails with the party. But now that she's just graduated from university, just started her first job, she's looking at politics in a different light. So I don't know what choice she'll make long term in life, but I think she's a lot more open to it than she might have been, say, 5 years ago. So I think there is, with distance from politics comes also a focus on the good part of politics and not necessarily some of the watching your step aspects, which can be very hurtful for families because they're the ones that pay the price more than you do.
Tony, I was going to go to you next. You've got three, relatively young kids. Sure. What do they think of politics?
Well, I always tell the story about my second son, Max, my middle guy, who said a couple years ago to Lynn, my wife, that he was considering doing what Dad does. And Lynn said, what, be a lawyer? And he said, no, if all else fails, I'll be a politician. And Lynn said, you might want to have a plan B for your plan B. Alex, my eldest guy, I guess I can say this now, he's just got his first summer job. Goes to university in Toronto, and he's going to be working for PC Research at Queen's Park. So it's just another generation right there.
Oh my God.
But they still have the P and the C.
That's right. David, I don't know. Do you have kids?
Yes, I have 4 children.
4 children, okay. And how do they regard politics?
You know, my wife and I are very careful with the kids. They're between 15 and 20, and if they want to engage or get involved, of course, during campaign time, it's mandatory. But that goes without saying. But we will encourage it if they show an interest. We don't force them to attend events, and we let them get on with their, hopefully, a happy childhood and finish their high school, university, and so on. So that's where we're at.
David, what if one of them wanted to run for the Conservatives?
I actually have, you know, Steve, I often like to say anybody who steps up to the plate today and seeks public office, whether they have a party or not, I take my hat off to them.
No, but he's talking about one of your kids. Now
That's
tell the
fine.
truth.
No,
you die.
I don't think so. I think that it's up to the kids. I mean, they're young adults. When they're young adults, if they want to make that decision. But anybody who wants to go into public service today, elected in public service, I take my hat off to.
Sheila, did you just say tell the truth?
Well, no, I'm just saying, I mean, I don't know. This is the best question to ask, actually, Mike, because his dad was an NDPer and his grandfather was a Conservative, and I knew his grandfather very well, and he was a fantastic member of Parliament from Montreal. I had a lot of respect for him, and you see those values that kind of drive that agenda. But I think if my children decided to go into politics in another party, I think I would feel that I had somehow failed them. I would feel that I failed them.
Tony, what if one of your kids wants to run for the Libs?
You know what? I'm okay with that. I think it would actually be kind of interesting.
You guys are still in active politics, so you have to mince your words.
My lesson is the same. If you've got passion for your country, love your country, love your community, believe in this place, that's what I care about, is passion, and the rest will fall into its proper place.
But extrapolating that, what if they were living in Quebec and wanted to run for the Bloc?
Okay, that's
I'm just saying,
that's
no,
different.
but I'm just saying, there are that
different.
kind of dynamic.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is different.
We had a rule.
That's too passionate, eh? Yeah.
We had a rule in our household that you had to try a bite of everything on your plate, but you didn't necessarily have to eat it all. So as long as you know what the other parties are about and understand where they're coming from, then you can choose what tastes best for you.
Did you ever ask your dad, though, how could you run for the Democrats when your dad was a Tory?
I don't think that ever came up. I saw.
How could that never come up? That's such an obvious question.
I saw the good work. He was elected before my grandfather was,
That's true.
and my grandfather was active in politics for a variety of different parties. Was asked to run for the Mulroney government by that party. It was more. I saw the good work he was doing and didn't question why he was doing it or what the colors meant. I just saw it for what it was, and that was just working hard for your community.
Huh. Do you have any kids?
I don't. I have a young niece. She's the first in that generation in our family. She's a little young for us to make any bets quite yet. She's more interested in her toys rather than anything else, as it should be.
And if she wanted to run, let's say we were 15 years ago and she wanted to run for the Reform Party, what would you say about that?
Well, I'm sure we'd have some lively discussions, but I would be in no position to stop her from following whatever convictions she has.
Gotcha. We got about 30 seconds left here, and I guess I really should ask, since your dad's been so public about his fighting prostate cancer, how's he doing?
He's doing really well. We've been through this before in my family with my grandfather, who fought and beat the same thing. The outpouring of support from Canadians across the country has just been wonderful, and it's meant a lot to him and to our whole family, so we thank everyone very much for that.
Great. Let's thank all 3 guests in Ottawa, Sheila Copps, Tony Clement, David McGuinty. Good of all of you to join us tonight on TVO. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
And to Mike Layton here in Toronto. This was a dynastic night here on TVO. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.